All right, let's just jump right into this. Welcome to The Explainer. Today we are looking at a truly cinematic premise: how 7 notorious global dictators were brought down from their absolute peaks of hubris right down to the very depths of humiliation. We're going to trace the visual and dramatic arc of tyrants who legitimately thought they were untouchable, right up until they collided with the strategic might of United States presidents. I mean, from dragging a dictator out of a literal dirt ditch, to a dawn raid in a presidential palace, to blasting rock music so loud a tyrant just threw his hands up and gave up, we are going to break down exactly how these geopolitical showdowns played out.
So, how exactly does a dictator go from holding completely unchecked power to facing absolute crushing humiliation? For anyone trying to understand the dynamics of global power today, this is really the core question. We're going to explore the specific playbooks and tactics that U.S. presidents have historically used to humble these regimes. And whether it ended at a polished negotiating table or behind bars, the methods vary wildly, but the results? They are undeniably dramatic.
Because throughout history, we see this incredibly stark before and after. On one side, you've got dictators at their peak, right? Surrounded by golden palaces, massive military parades, totally buying into their own invincible hype. And then on the other side, we see them at their absolute lowest, pulled from camouflaged spider holes or slapped in handcuffs. It just goes to show that no amount of anti-American rhetoric or iron-fisted rule can save a tyrant when a U.S. president decides their time is finally up.
Playbook number 1: total military annihilation.
Okay, so this is your traditional, overwhelming, brute force approach. And it starts with the biggest bully of them all, Adolf Hitler, who believed his so-called thousand-year Reich was just going to conquer the world. By the early 1940s, his war machine was absolutely crushing Europe. But then, he made arguably one of the worst strategic moves in human history. He declared war on the United States. President Franklin D. Roosevelt responded by transforming America into what he famously called the arsenal of democracy. Factories that used to just make cars were suddenly pumping out tanks and planes. The U.S. began outproducing every other country's military combined. And FDR didn't just want to win. Actually, scratch that, he demanded unconditional surrender. No deals, just absolute defeat.
And the sheer scale of this response is just staggering. To put it into perspective, on June 6, 1944, the Allies launched D-Day, sending over 150,000 troops storming right onto the beaches of Normandy. From there, American and Allied forces relentlessly pushed across Europe, while the Soviets closed in from the east. Hitler's seemingly invincible army was just completely squeezed from both sides.
The irony here is just profound. Hitler, the guy who once mocked Americans as mongrels who didn't know how to fight, spent his final days absolutely terrified, cowering in a concrete bunker beneath Berlin while Soviet artillery rained down. The terrified dictator was forced underground while his entire empire crumbled right above his head, ending his life there on April 30th, 1945, right before his military surrendered unconditionally.
Fast forward a bit to 2003, and we see President George W. Bush utilizing a similarly devastating military blitz, this time against Saddam Hussein. For 24 years, Saddam terrorized his people, building these lavish palaces and posing in military uniforms like he was totally untouchable. But when U.S. and coalition forces launched the Iraq War, they captured Baghdad in just 3 weeks. 3 weeks! Saddam completely vanished, which sparked this massive manhunt.
For months, U.S. forces hunted him, raining safe houses, tracking down every single lead. And finally, on December 13, 2003, the mighty Saddam Hussein, a man who ruled entirely through fear, was found hiding on a farmhouse property in a camouflaged spider hole. It was barely big enough for one person. When soldiers actually pulled him from the dirt, he was filthy, exhausted, sporting the scraggly beard. One soldier even noted he looked entirely resigned to his fate. The visual of a man trading a golden palace for a literal dirt ditch, that is the ultimate humbling.
Moving on to playbook number 2, the strategic chokeholds.
Because sometimes, you don't actually need a total invasion. You just need to suffocate a dictator. We see this super clearly back in 1913, when Mexican General Victoriano Huerta pulled off a violently brutal military coup, murdering the democratically elected president. Now, while other world powers recognized Huerta's strongman regime, mostly for the sake of stability and oil, newly inaugurated U.S. President Woodrow Wilson flat-out refused. He boldly called Huerta's regime a government of butchers, which completely set the stage for a major showdown.
In April 1914, Wilson got the exact excuse he needed to act. 9 U.S. sealers were briefly arrested in Tampico, Mexico.
They were released with an apology, but the U.S. admiral demanded a 21-gun salute to the American flag. Huerta refused, so Wilson used this to just drop the hammer. He ordered 800 U.S. Marines and sailors to seize Veracruz, Mexico's most important port city, and held it for 7 months.
Boom, just like that. By taking Veracruz, Wilson effectively cut off Huerta's cash and his guns in one single, devastating move. Financially and militarily suffocated and getting squeezed by rebel forces from literally all sides, Huerta's regime totally collapsed. By July 1914, he resigned and fled into exile. Decades later, President John F. Kennedy used a very similar chokehold tactic, but this time, the fate of the entire world was on the line. In October 1962, U.S. spy planes discovered the Soviet Union secretly installing nuclear missiles in Cuba. But instead of bombing or invading, JFK chose a middle path, a naval quarantine. For 13 terrifying days, the world was literally at DEFCON 2. American forces held that blockade line, and JFK held firm, refusing to blink. Finally, on October 28th, Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev backed down.
Now, behind the scenes, Kennedy did make a secret deal to eventually pull U.S. missiles out of Turkey, but publicly, to the rest of the world, and far more importantly, to his own people back in Moscow, it looked like Khrushchev had just completely folded under U.S. pressure. It's such a strong reminder of how absolutely crucial optics are in global power. This massive blow to Soviet prestige was an outright humiliation, and it directly led to Khrushchev being removed from power by his own government just 2 years later.
Playbook number 3. Unconventional psychological warfare.
So, when traditional force isn't the primary tool, presidents can get highly unorthodox. Let's look at 1989. Manuel Noriega, the military dictator of Panama and former CIA asset, had basically turned his country into his own personal cartel-level drug trafficking operation. President George H.W. Bush had seen enough. He launched Operation Just Cause, sending over 24,000 U.S. troops right into Panama. The Panamanian military folded immediately, but Noriega? He managed to slip away.
So where did this tough guy dictator run to hide? The Vatican Embassy. He figured diplomatic immunity would save him, but American troops didn't breach the doors. They simply surrounded the compound and deployed a sonic assault. I'm talking blasting rock music, like Van Halen's Panama and Kenny Loggins' Danger Zone, at maximum volume, 24 hours a day, nonstop, aimed right at Noriega's window. After days of this relentless, honestly absurd playlist, Noriega just couldn't take it anymore. On January 3rd, 1990, he walked out, surrendered, and was flown to Miami in handcuffs. No way he saw that coming.
More recently, we saw this kind of psychological warfare take on a completely digital form. In 2017, North Korea's Kim Jong-un was aggressively testing missiles. Instead of using careful, traditional diplomatic language, President Donald Trump just took to Twitter. He dubbed Kim Little Rocket Man. Kim fired back, calling Trump a dotard. Trump then claimed his nuclear button was bigger and that his actually worked. The whole world watched these two leaders publicly trash-talk each other like it was a UFC press conference.
A lot of people were terrified this public humiliation would lead straight to war, but it actually worked. All that unorthodox, erratic pressure forced the most reclusive dictator on the planet right to the negotiating table. By 2018, Kim Jong-un agreed to a historic face-to-face summit in Singapore. The guy went from launching missiles over Japan to sitting across the table asking for a deal. It was this totally modern digital form of humbling, showing us that sometimes erratic public pressure can achieve what quiet diplomacy just can't.
Playbook number 4. Lightning Covert Operations.
This is the shockingly direct method of humiliation detailed in the source material we're looking at today, the covert snatch and grab. According to the narrative we're examining, this played out incredibly dramatically in Venezuela. For years, Nicolas Maduro clung to power while his economy collapsed into complete hyperinflation. He rigged elections, crushed protests, faced U.S. indictments for drug trafficking, and he just ignored it all. That is, until President Trump authorized Operation Absolute Resolve. In the early morning hours, U.S. Special Operations Forces executed a lightning strike directly into Caracas.
Think about it. Maduro spent years screaming from his palace about American plots, constantly railing against Yankee imperialism. But by dawn, he literally woke up in U.S. custody, extracted entirely from his seat of power. It sent this massive shockwave across the globe. It's a reminder that no amount of loud anti-American speeches will save you when a U.S. president quietly decides the game is over.
Which brings us to the ultimate cost of hubris. Because across different eras, facing totally different types of tyrants, the application of presidential power consistently shatters dictatorial hubris.
We've seen how American presidents utilize brute military force, suffocating economic chokeholds, bizarre psychological pressure, and lightning-fast covert ops. These dictators always start in golden palaces, right? Surrounded by their military parades, but history shows us they end in concrete bunkers, dirt ditches, or handcuffs. So whether by overwhelming force, strategic chokeholds, or literally a classic rock playlist, it leaves you wondering, who will be the next global tyrant to trade their palace for a hole?